Margaret Maggie Sullivan was 62 years old when Apex Aviation fired her for being too slow to adapt to modern systems. But what they didn't know was that she had been flying experimental aircraft since before their CEO was born. The boardroom buzzed with the kind of casual cruelty that corporate executives mistake for efficiency, completely unaware that the woman they had just dismissed had saved more lives than all of them combined would ever touch. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous HR representative who couldn't meet her eyes. Restructuring, they called it. Streamlining operations for the digital age. But Maggie had been in aviation long enough to recognize the real language hidden beneath corporate speak. She was too old, too female, and too expensive for a company that valued algorithms over experience. Her small apartment, overlooking San Francisco Bay, reflected the discipline of someone who had learned to live with precision. Every flight manual is arranged by publication date. Navigation charts from 6 different decades organized in perfect chronological order. A single coffee cup in the sink, washed and waiting for tomorrow's pre-dawn ritual. The walls bore no photographs, no certificates, no evidence of the extraordinary career that had shaped modern aviation safety protocols. The morning routine never varied regardless of employment status. 4:30 wake up, no alarm needed. Her internal chronometer had been calibrated by years of transatlantic flights when GPS was science fiction and weather forecasts were educated guesses. 50 push-ups on the hardwood floor, movements sharp and controlled despite joints that carried the accumulated stress of 30,000 flight hours. Coffee black as midnight, weather check from 3 different services, and the eternal optimism that somewhere, someone needed a pilot who understood that flying was equal parts science and art. Her hands told stories she never shared. Calluses from control yokes before power steering existed in aircraft. Scars from emergency repairs at 30,000 feet when mechanical failure meant innovation or death. The slight tremor in her left index finger, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. Souvenir from a night flight over the North Atlantic, when ice brought down systems one by one and only instinct kept 200 souls breathing. Dismissal from Apex had been particularly cruel because it came just days before the company's most important flight demonstration. A new navigation system that promised to revolutionize commercial aviation, making flights safer, more efficient, more profitable. Maggie had spent 18 months developing the training protocols, understanding the system's capabilities and limitations better than the engineers who designed it. Her replacement was 34 years, old with an MBA and a pilot's license earned on weekends. Young pilots at Apex had gravitated toward her, despite her reputation for demanding perfection. She taught without seeming to teach, correcting their assumptions with gentle precision, showing them techniques that existed in no manual. "Feel the aircraft," she would say, guiding their hands on the controls. "The instruments tell you what happened. The aircraft tells you what's happening. Your instincts tell you what's going to happen." They wondered how she knew things that took veteran pilots decades to learn, but she deflected their questions with weather talk and procedure reviews. When pressed about her background, she would smile and change the subject. "Here and there," was her standard response. "You pick things up when you pay attention to what matters." The scars were invisible to most observers, hidden beneath professional blazers and regulation flight suits. But sometimes, when she was deep in concentration, reviewing flight plans or analyzing weather patterns, her sleeves would ride up slightly. Thin white lines where restraint marks had once been. Barely visible indentations on her wrists from zip ties, applied with military precision. The marks of someone who had been captured, held, and had somehow survived experiences that would break. Most people. Captain Jennifer Torres, one of the younger pilots, had noticed them first. recognized the pattern from her own military service. "Bad decisions when I was younger," Maggie explained when asked. But Jennifer, who had seen her share of veterans with ghosts, didn't push. Some stories told themselves in silence. In the way someone checked exits when entering rooms, how they sat with backs to walls, the micro-flinch when someone dropped a clipboard too loudly. The way Maggie moved through the hangar spoke of muscle. Memory older than the aircraft she serviced. She understood the subtle language of mechanical systems, could diagnose problems by sound alone. During pre-flight checks, while others followed checklists religiously, Maggie would pause at seemingly random intervals, pressing her ear against components, running her fingers along surfaces that looked perfectly normal to untrained eyes. "Resonance. Frequency is off by 0.2%, she would announce, and maintenance crews would discover stress fractures invisible to standard inspection procedures. When asked how she knew, she would deflect with technical explanations that were accurate but incomplete. The truth was simpler and more complex. Some knowledge came from places that officially didn't exist, experiences that had no paper trail, training that had been classified beyond recognition. Her apartment contained books and languages most people couldn't identify, technical manuals for aircraft that never entered commercial service, navigation charts for regions that appeared on no civilian maps, flight logs with dates redacted and destinations that existed only in classified databases. She told neighbors, who asked that she collect aviation history, had always been fascinated by experimental aircraft development, that the firing from Apex had come with a severance package that was generous by industry standards, but insulting considering her contributions. 18 months of developing training protocols reduced to a form letter thanking her for her service and wishing her well in future endeavors. The new safety procedures she had written, based on hard-earned experience in conditions most pilots would never face, were already being rebranded under someone else's authority. But Maggie had faced worse dismissals before. In 1987, she had been quietly removed from an experimental test pilot program when budget cuts required eliminating non-essential personnel. The program had been testing stealth technology that wouldn't be publicly acknowledged for another decade. Her dismissal had nothing to do with competence and everything to do with congressional committees that viewed classified programs as convenient targets for symbolic cost-cutting. The transition from military to civilian aviation had been jarring, in ways that had nothing to do with technology or procedures. Commercial pilots talked about weather delays and passenger complaints. Military pilots talked about mission parameters and acceptable losses. The gap between those worlds was measured in more than just salary scales and benefit packages. It was the difference between flying to get people home safely and flying to ensure they had homes to return to. Evening routines at the apartment followed the same precision as morning preparations. Equipment maintenance performed with surgical attention to detail. Flight bag organized with emergency supplies that exceeded civilian requirements by several orders of magnitude. A personal emergency beacon that operated on frequencies reserved for military applications. Water purification tablets, high-energy rations, medical supplies sufficient for field surgery. The preparation of someone who had learned that survival often depended on equipment others considered unnecessary. The mirror in her bathroom reflected a woman whose appearance told a carefully edited story. Gray hair kept in a regulation cut that satisfied both civilian employers and personal preference. Lines around her eyes that suggested years of squinting through cockpit windows at horizons that promised either safety or danger. A posture that remained military straight, despite decades of attempting to blend into civilian environments. Hidden beneath conservative business attire, her body carried a map of experiences that would never appear in any official biography. A surgical scar along her ribs where shrapnel had been removed in a field hospital that didn't exist. Burn marks on her left shoulder from an aircraft fire that had never been officially reported. Vaccination scars from diseases endemic to regions were American. Aircraft supposedly never flew. The phone calls had started the day after her termination. Former students reaching out with job offers, consulting opportunities, teaching positions. At flight schools that valued experience over youth. But Maggie had politely declined them all. Something in the pattern of her dismissal from Apex felt familiar, like a melody played in a different key, but fundamentally unchanged. The same orchestrated removal she had experienced before when her continued presence threatened someone's carefully constructed narrative. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams that felt more like memories. Cockpits of aircraft that existed only in classified hangars. Flight paths over terrain that appeared on no commercial charts. Radio communications in codes that had been changed decades ago for security reasons that remained valid. She would wake knowing that somewhere, aircraft were flying routes she had mapped, using procedures she had developed, carrying passengers who would never know that their safety depended on protocols written by a woman officially too old to understand modern aviation. The dismissal letter sat on her kitchen table like an artifact from someone else's life. The signature belonged to Richard Blackwood, Apex Aviation's chief operating officer, a man whose career had been built on innovations he had acquired rather than developed. His reputation for aggressive cost-cutting masked a deeper pattern of taking credit for work performed by subordinates he subsequently eliminated. Maggie was simply the latest casualty in a strategy that had proven profitable for shareholders and devastating for employees. But what Blackwood didn't understand, what he couldn't understand without access to classified personnel files that had been sealed decades ago, was that Maggie Sullivan wasn't just another aging employee whose dismissal would save the company money. She was a living repository of aviation knowledge that couldn't be replicated through training programs or simulation software. Her experience base included situations that commercial pilots hoped never to encounter. Emergency procedures developed through trial and error when failure meant death rather than paperwork. The knowledge lived in her hands, in muscle memory, calibrated by aircraft that pushed the boundaries of physics and human endurance. It resided in pattern recognition developed through flights, where weather forecasts were approximations and mechanical reliability was a statistical probability rather than a guarantee. Most importantly, it existed in decision-making protocols, forged under pressure that transformed theoretical knowledge into survival instincts. As night settled over San Francisco Bay, Maggie performed her final equipment check of the day. Personal flight bag organized for immediate deployment. Navigation tools calibrated and ready. Emergency communications equipment tested and verified. The routine of someone who understood that readiness was a permanent state of mind, not a temporary response to crisis. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that age was an asset rather than a liability in professions where experience meant the difference between successful outcomes and catastrophic failures. But tonight, she would rest with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose conscience was clear, whose skills remained sharp, and whose service to aviation safety would continue regardless of corporate employment status. The woman Apex Aviation had dismissed as too old to adapt to modern systems would soon demonstrate that some forms of knowledge couldn't be programmed into computers or learned from textbooks. Some expertise could only be earned through decades of service in conditions that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of commercial aviation. And some pilots, once they had proven themselves under the most demanding circumstances imaginable, never truly stopped flying. They simply changed aircraft and destinations, while maintaining the same unwavering commitment to bringing everyone home safely. The corporate boardroom at Meridian Airlines occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Century Tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the San Francisco Bay that stretched toward the Pacific. The mahogany conference table could seat 24 executives comfortably. though today only 12 chairs were occupied by men and women whose combined salaries could fund a small airline for an entire fiscal quarter. At the head of the table sat Richard Blackwood, Chief Operating Officer of Apex Aviation, and today's guest presenter, his silver hair perfectly styled and his Armani suit pressed to military precision. The presentation had been building toward this moment for 45 minutes. Blackwood's voice carried the practiced confidence of a man who had never piloted an aircraft, but had built a career on understanding the financial mathematics of aviation better than most pilots understood aerodynamics. Our new integrated flight management system represents a quantum leap forward in commercial aviation safety, he announced, advancing to the next slide with theatrical timing. Artificial intelligence combined with predictive analytics will reduce pilot error by 73% while improving fuel efficiency by 18%. The executives around the table nodded with the synchronized appreciation of people who measured innovation in quarterly profit projections rather than lives saved. Charts and graphs displayed impressive statistics about reduced training costs, streamlined operations, and competitive advantages that would position Meridian as the industry leader in next-generation aviation technology. The numbers were compelling, enough to justify the 8-figure investment Blackwood was proposing, but the presentation was interrupted by an unexpected complication. The conference room door opened to admit Margaret Sullivan, carrying a maintenance clipboard and wearing the standard issue coveralls of Meridian's aircraft servicing division. Her appearance was so incongruous with the boardroom's executive atmosphere that several participants assumed she had entered the wrong room by mistake. The interruption came at precisely the moment Blackwood was explaining how automated systems would eliminate the need for expensive veteran pilots whose salaries represented inefficient resource allocation. "Excuse me," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the sharp edge of irritation masked as polite professionalism. "This is a private meeting. The cleaning staff isn't scheduled until after 6. Maggie looked up from her clipboard, her expression neutral but her eyes noting every detail of the room's occupants with the systematic efficiency of someone trained to assess tactical situations rapidly. "I'm not cleaning the staff, sir. Aircraft maintenance inspection. We need to verify pre-flight systems before tomorrow's demonstration flight." The explanation should have been sufficient, but something about her presence seemed to unsettle Blackwood in ways that went beyond simple scheduling inconvenience. Perhaps it was the way she stood, balanced and alert like someone prepared to respond to emergencies. Perhaps it was how her eyes moved systematically across the room, cataloging exits and potential threats with professional thoroughness. Or perhaps it was simply that her interruption had occurred at the precise moment he was discussing the obsolescence of experienced aviation personnel. "Maintenance inspections are scheduled through proper channels," Blackwood replied, his tone becoming more aggressive. "I don't know what kind of operation Meridian runs, but at Apex Aviation, we maintain professional standards that don't include random interruptions during executive presentations." The comment drew nervous laughter from several board members, who recognized the implicit criticism of their company's protocols. Meridian's CEO, Patricia Hayes, felt the need to defend her organization while simultaneously demonstrating appropriate deference to their prestigious guest. "I apologize, Mr. Blackwood. Our maintenance procedures are normally quite thorough, Miss Sullivan," Maggie replied, her voice carrying no trace of defensiveness despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere. "Margaret Sullivan. I've been with Meridian for 3 months, handling specialized systems integration." Blackwood's expression shifted as recognition flickered across his features. The name was familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it in context. Something about Margaret Sullivan triggered a memory that felt both relevant and uncomfortable, like trying to recall a face glimpsed in old photographs whose significance had been forgotten. "Sullivan," he repeated slowly, as if testing the sound for hidden meanings. "That name sounds familiar. Weren't you recently terminated from Apex Aviation for performance deficiencies? The question landed in the conference room like a precision-guided missile designed to inflict maximum damage on both target and surroundings. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, recognizing the deliberate cruelty of public humiliation, but uncertain how to respond without challenging their guest's authority. The power dynamics were clear. Blackwood represented potential investment capital worth hundreds of millions, while Sullivan was a maintenance worker whose employment status was irrelevant to quarterly earnings projections. "I was let go," Maggie confirmed, her voice maintaining the same steady tone despite the obvious attempt at professional assassination. "Budget restructuring, according to the official documentation." "Budget restructuring," Blackwood laughed, the sound carrying no warmth or humor. "That's a polite way of describing what happens when companies can no longer afford to carry dead weight. The aviation industry is evolving beyond the capabilities of people who learn to fly when instruments were analog and navigation required slide rules." He advanced to his next presentation slide, which displayed a graph comparing training costs for traditional pilots versus operators of automated flight systems. The data supported his argument that modern aviation could achieve superior safety records while reducing personnel expenses through technological advancement. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he continued, gesturing toward Maggie as if she were a visual aid. "Old-school mentality that views every innovation as a threat rather than an opportunity." The attack was designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. It discredited any potential objections to his proposal by suggesting that opposition came from obsolete thinking. It demonstrated his willingness to make difficult personnel decisions for the greater good of organizational efficiency. Most importantly, it established his authority to identify and eliminate inefficiencies that lesser executives might overlook due to misplaced sentiment. Patricia Hayes felt caught between conflicting loyalties and practical considerations. Sullivan had been hired specifically for her expertise with complex avionics integration, and her performance over 3 months had been exemplary. But challenging Blackwood's assessment risked derailing negotiations that could transform Meridian's competitive position in the commercial aviation market. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately," Hayes suggested, hoping to de-escalate the situation before it causes permanent damage to either the business relationship or Sullivan's employment prospects. "No, this is perfect," Blackwood insisted, warming to his theme with the enthusiasm of someone who had found an ideal teaching opportunity. "Miss Sullivan represents exactly the kind of thinking that's holding our industry back. Tell me, what's your assessment of the integrated flight management system? Do you think it represents progress or just another gadget that complicates simple procedures?" The question was carefully crafted to elicit either technical incompetence or Luddite resistance, either of which would support his broader argument about the need for personnel modernization. Blackwood expected Sullivan to either demonstrate ignorance of advanced systems or express the reflexive hostility that traditional mechanics often showed toward innovations that threatened their job security. Instead, Maggie set down her clipboard and moved closer to the presentation screen, studying the technical specifications with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in the engineering details. Her analysis took longer than Blackwood had anticipated, and her silence began to feel more ominous than reassuring. "The predictive algorithms are impressive," she said finally, her voice carrying none of the uncertainty Blackwood had expected, particularly the integration between weather modeling and fuel optimization protocols. "But there's a fundamental assumption error in the failure cascade analysis." The response caught Blackwood off guard. He had expected either confusion or dismissal, not sophisticated technical critique from someone he had categorized as obsolete personnel. "Failure cascade analysis?" "Emergency procedures," Maggie explained, pointing to specific elements on the slide without touching the expensive projection equipment. The system assumes that automated responses will always be superior to human judgment. But that assumption breaks down when facing scenarios outside the training parameters. What happens when the aircraft encounters conditions that weren't included in the algorithm development? The question revealed a level of understanding that shouldn't have existed in a maintenance worker's knowledge base. Blackwood found himself in the unexpected position of defending technical decisions to someone whose expertise he had just publicly dismissed. The system includes comprehensive failure protocols based on analysis of every significant aviation incident over the past 20 years. Every documented incident, Maggie corrected gently. But documentation requires survivors who can file reports. Some failures don't leave witnesses to describe what went wrong. The distinction was subtle but profound, suggesting knowledge of aviation emergencies that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of commercial flight safety statistics. Board members who had been following the technical discussion with polite incomprehension began to sense that something significant was happening beneath the surface of what appeared to be a routine disagreement about technological advancement. "Are you suggesting," Blackwood asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "that you have access to incident data that our engineering team somehow missed?" "I'm suggesting that experience has value," Maggie replied. "Simulation can prepare pilots for known scenarios, but aviation safety ultimately depends on human judgment when facing the unknown." "Human judgment," Blackwood repeated mockingly. "The same human judgment that causes pilot error in 68% of commercial aviation accidents? The same intuition that leads to poor decisions under stress? Ms. Sullivan, with all due respect to your maintenance background, aviation safety requires precision engineering, not folklore passed down from pilots who learned to fly in less sophisticated times." The dismissal was calculated to end the discussion while reinforcing his central argument about the superiority of technological solutions over human decision-making. But something in Maggie's expression suggested that Blackwood had ventured into territory where his assumptions might prove inadequate. "Precision engineering is essential," she agreed. "But engineering solutions are only as good as the people who implement them when normal procedures don't apply. What happens when your integrated system encounters icing conditions outside the algorithm parameters? What if communication systems fail during approach and weather that wasn't forecast? What if mechanical failures occur in combinations that weren't anticipated during system design?" Each question built upon the previous one, creating a cascade of scenarios that revealed the limitations of purely technological approaches to aviation safety. Blackwood realized that he was no longer controlling the direction of the conversation, that somehow a maintenance worker was dictating the terms of a technical discussion he should have dominated effortlessly. "Those are extremely unlikely scenarios," he responded, falling back on statistical probabilities that had served him well in previous presentations. "The system is designed to handle 97% of possible flight conditions. What about the other 3%? Maggie asked quietly. The question hung in the conference room air like an unexploded ordnance, waiting to detonate under the weight of its implications. Board members began to understand that they were witnessing something more significant than a disagreement about maintenance procedures. This was a fundamental challenge to assumptions about aviation safety that could affect every decision they made about technological investment and personnel management. Blackwood felt the presentation slipping away from his control, transforming from a confident demonstration of technological superiority into an uncomfortable examination of system limitations he preferred not to discuss. The woman he had dismissed as obsolete personnel was systematically dismantling arguments that had convinced executives at dozens of airlines to invest billions in automated flight systems. But retreat was not an option when the stakes included both professional reputation and financial opportunity. Blackwood doubled down on his attack, shifting from technical arguments to personal credibility assessments that were designed to destroy Sullivan's standing without engaging her substantive Criticisms. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone accustomed to ending careers with bureaucratic precision. "I think this conversation has revealed exactly why some people struggle to adapt to modern aviation standards. Your question suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of how contemporary safety systems actually function." The words were chosen to inflict maximum professional damage while maintaining plausible deniability about their personal nature. Blackwood had made a critical miscalculation. He had assumed that Sullivan would respond to humiliation the way most employees responded, with defensive retreat or angry outburst that would validate his assessment of her professional limitations. Instead, Maggie simply nodded with the calm acceptance of someone who had faced far worse attacks from opponents with considerably more power to inflict damage. Her composure in the face of deliberate provocation began to suggest that Richard Blackwood might have chosen the wrong target for his demonstration of executive authority. Captain Jennifer Torres had been sitting in the back corner of the boardroom, invited as Meridian's senior pilot representative, but largely ignored during the technical presentations that focused more on profit margins than flight operations. Her presence was ceremonial, a gesture toward including operational personnel in decisions that would fundamentally alter how commercial aviation functioned. But something about the exchange between Blackwood and Sullivan had triggered recognition, patterns that made her lean forward with growing attention. 23 years of flying commercial aircraft had taught Jennifer to read people as carefully as she read weather patterns. Passengers revealed their fears through micro-expressions in body language that indicated whether turbulence would cause panic or acceptance. Flight attendants communicated emergency status through glances and gestures that bypassed radio protocols. Airport personnel signaled problems through timing and positioning that spoke louder than official announcements. Margaret Sullivan was displaying none of the defensive behaviors that Jennifer expected from a maintenance worker under attack from a powerful executive. Her posture remained balanced and alert, suggesting readiness rather than retreat. Her breathing stayed controlled despite the obvious stress of public humiliation. Most tellingly, her eyes continued their systematic assessment of the rooms, occupants and exits, indicating tactical awareness that extended far beyond normal workplace caution. The technical questions Sullivan had raised weren't the confused objections of someone intimidated by advanced technology. They were the precise inquiries of someone who understood aviation systems at a level that matched Jennifer's own expertise, despite supposedly working in maintenance rather than flight operations. The depth of knowledge required to identify algorithmic limitations in predictive systems suggested experience with emergency scenarios that went far beyond routine commercial flying. During a brief pause, while Blackwood consulted his notes, Jennifer made a decision that would later prove pivotal to everything that followed. She activated the voice recording function on her phone, ostensibly to capture technical details for later review, but actually to preserve evidence of what was beginning to feel like a significant moment in aviation history. "Miss Sullivan," she interjected, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose pilot credentials commanded automatic respect in aviation environments. "Could you elaborate on your concerns about failure cascade scenarios? Specifically, what types of emergency conditions do you think might exceed system parameters?" The question shifted the room's dynamic by introducing a voice of technical credibility that couldn't be dismissed as easily as maintenance personnel. Blackwood's expression tightened as he realized that Sullivan now had an ally whose expertise matched his own, at least in the perception of board members who relied on professional credentials to evaluate competing arguments. Margaret turned toward Jennifer with something that might have been gratitude, though her expression remained professionally neutral. "Emergency scenarios that combine multiple system failures with environmental conditions outside normal parameters," she began, her voice taking on the measured cadence of someone accustomed to briefing complex information under pressure. Accumulation beyond certification standards, combined with communication equipment failure during approach to minimums. Bird strike damage affecting multiple engines, simultaneously during takeoff in crosswind conditions, exceeding design specifications. Scenarios she described weren't theoretical possibilities pulled from training manuals. They were specific enough to suggest personal familiarity with exactly the kind of emergency conditions that commercial pilots hoped never to encounter. Jennifer recognized the difference between academic knowledge and experiential understanding. And Sullivan was clearly drawing from the latter category. "Those are extremely rare combinations," Blackwood interjected, trying to regain control of the discussion before it undermined his entire presentation. Modern commercial aviation operates within safety margins that make such scenarios statistically insignificant. Statistical insignificance doesn't comfort the families of people who die in the 3% of cases where automation proves inadequate. Sullivan replied, her voice carrying an emotional weight that suggested more than theoretical concern. For passenger safety. Jennifer felt something click into place, a recognition that had been building throughout the conversation, but hadn't crystallized until that moment. Sullivan's knowledge wasn't academic or theoretical. It was earned through direct experience with exactly the kind of emergency scenario she described. The question was how a maintenance worker had acquired expertise that typically belonged to test pilots or military aviation personnel. "Miss Sullivan," Jennifer said carefully, "what's your background before joining Meridian? Your technical knowledge seems quite extensive for someone in aircraft maintenance." The question was innocent enough to avoid challenging Sullivan directly, while probing for information that might explain the discrepancy between her current position and her apparent expertise. But the reaction it produced suggested that Jennifer had stumbled onto sensitive territory. For the first time since entering the boardroom, Sullivan's composure showed a hairline crack. A micro-expression of caution flickered across her features before being immediately suppressed. Her hand moved unconsciously toward her left wrist, where Jennifer caught a glimpse of faded marks that looked disturbingly familiar to someone who had served in military environments where interrogation resistance training was standard procedure. "Here and there," Sullivan answered, using the same deflection she had employed at Apex Aviation when younger pilots asked about her background. "You pick things up when you pay attention to what matters." But Jennifer was no longer satisfied with evasive responses. Something about Sullivan's presence in the room felt significant beyond the immediate context of Blackwood's presentation. The combination of technical expertise, tactical awareness, and emotional investment in aviation safety suggested a background that extended far beyond civilian maintenance work. "Attention to detail is important," Jennifer agreed, "but the level of system knowledge you're demonstrating typically requires formal training or extensive operational experience. Have you worked with military aviation programs?" The question landed with more impact than Jennifer had anticipated. Sullivan's reaction was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to read body language under stress. A slight stiffening of posture that indicated defensive preparation. A fractional adjustment of stance that suggested readiness for rapid movement. Most tellingly, a momentary glance toward the nearest exit that spoke of ingrained survival instincts rather than casual discomfort. Blackwood sensed an opportunity to regain control of the situation by exploiting what appeared to be Sullivan's vulnerability regarding her background. "That's an interesting question, Captain Torres. Ms. Sullivan, perhaps you could enlighten us about your qualifications to critique engineering systems that represent millions of dollars in research and development." The attack was designed to force Sullivan into either admitting inadequate credentials or revealing background information she obviously preferred to keep private. Blackwood assumed that either outcome would restore his authority and discredit her technical objections to his presentation. Instead, Sullivan made a choice that surprised everyone in the room, including Jennifer. Rather than continuing her evasive responses or retreating under pressure, She decided to provide a partial answer that revealed more than she had intended. "I've worked with experimental flight systems," she said quietly. "Some experience with emergency protocols development and failure analysis under extreme conditions." The admission was carefully worded to provide minimal information while acknowledging sufficient background to justify her technical comments. But to Jennifer's trained ear, the phrasing suggested something more significant than routine commercial aviation experience. "Experimental flight systems," Jennifer repeated, her pilot's instinct for detail focusing on the specific terminology Sullivan had chosen. "That's a pretty specialized field. Most experimental work is either military or classified contractor programs." The observation wasn't accusatory, but it established a logical framework that made Sullivan's evasiveness more understandable. If her background included classified aviation programs, her reluctance to discuss specifics would be professionally required rather than personally motivated. Blackwood recognized that the conversation was moving in directions that didn't support his agenda. Rather than allowing further exploration of Sullivan's background, he decided to attack her credibility through different means. "Experimental flight systems," he said mockingly. "That sounds very impressive, Ms. Sullivan. I'm sure our board members are fascinated by your mysterious background in classified aviation programs. But this discussion is about practical commercial applications, not fantasy scenarios from action movies." The dismissal was calculated to make Sullivan's claim sound grandiose and unbelievable, while positioning Blackwood as the voice of practical business sense. But the tactic backfired when Jennifer decided to press for specific technical details that would either validate or discredit Sullivan's claimed expertise. "Miss Sullivan," Jennifer said, "you mentioned failure cascade analysis. Could you walk us through how you would handle a scenario where automated systems provide conflicting information during emergency approach conditions?" The question was designed as a test. Jennifer had faced exactly that situation 3 years earlier during a winter storm approach to Denver International Airport, when conflicting instrument readings and automated system warnings had created a decision matrix that required choosing between competing technological recommendations and personal judgment based on flight experience. Sullivan's response demonstrated not only theoretical knowledge but practical understanding of how such scenarios actually unfolded in real flight conditions. Primary assessment focuses on fundamental aircraft attitude and performance rather than individual system readings. She began, launching into a detailed analysis that revealed familiarity with emergency decision-making protocols that weren't taught in civilian flight training programs. Her explanation included specific techniques for prioritizing information sources, methods for cross-checking system reliability under stress, and decision trees for managing conflicting automated recommendations that suggested experience with aircraft systems considerably more advanced than standard commercial aviation equipment. Jennifer found herself taking mental notes as Sullivan described emergency procedures that she recognized from her own military flight training but had never encountered in civilian contexts. The level of detail and the practical focus on split-second decision-making under extreme stress suggested a background with experimental aircraft that pushed both technological and human performance boundaries. "Where did you learn those procedures?" Jennifer asked, her question carrying genuine curiosity rather than skeptical challenge. "Various places," Sullivan replied, returning to her pattern of evasive responses. "Emergency protocols tend to be similar across different aircraft types once you understand the underlying principles." But Jennifer wasn't satisfied with the generalities. Something about Sullivan's knowledge base felt familiar in ways that triggered memories from her own military service. The specific terminology, the methodical approach to emergency analysis, the assumption that pilots would be operating in conditions where normal procedures might prove inadequate. "Miss Sullivan," she said carefully, "have we met before?" "Your approach to emergency analysis sounds familiar." The question was based more on intuition than specific recollection, but Sullivan's reaction suggested that Jennifer's instinct was accurate. A flicker of recognition passed across Sullivan's features before being quickly suppressed, indicating that she also felt some level of familiarity with Jennifer's voice or presence. "I don't think so," Sullivan replied, but her tone lacked the certainty of her previous responses. Jennifer made a mental note to research Sullivan's background more thoroughly after the meeting. Something about their interaction felt significant beyond the immediate context of Blackwood's presentation, suggesting connections that extended into areas where civilian and military aviation intersected in ways that weren't always officially documented. The recognition was mutual but incomplete, like trying to remember a face glimpsed in old photographs whose context had been forgotten. Both women sensed that their paths had crossed before, but neither could immediately place where or under what circumstances such a meeting might have occurred. Blackwood, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly frustrated with the direction of the conversation. What had begun as a straightforward technology presentation was devolving into a technical discussion that he couldn't control and couldn't win against opponents whose expertise exceeded his own in areas that mattered to his audience. "Ladies," he said with forced joviality that barely concealed his irritation, "I appreciate this fascinating discussion of theoretical emergency scenarios, but perhaps we could return to the practical benefits that Meridian's board members need to understand in order to make informed investment decisions." The attempt to redirect the conversation back to financial considerations was reasonable from a business perspective, but it came too late to repair the damage that Sullivan's technical critique had inflicted on his presentation's credibility. Board members who had been impressed by his statistical analysis were now questioning whether those statistics adequately addressed the safety concerns that Sullivan had raised. Patricia Hayes, Meridian's CEO, found herself in the uncomfortable position of managing competing interests that couldn't be easily reconciled. Blackwood represented potential investment that could transform her company's competitive position, but Sullivan had raised safety questions that couldn't be ignored without potential liability implications. "Perhaps," Hayes suggested diplomatically, "we could schedule additional technical reviews that address the concerns Ms. Sullivan has raised while continuing our evaluation of Mr. Blackwood's proposal." The compromise satisfied no one but offered everyone a face-saving exit from a situation that had become more complex than anyone had anticipated. Blackwood accepted the delay while privately planning to ensure that Sullivan's continued employment at Meridian wouldn't interfere with future discussions of his technology systems. But as the meeting concluded and participants began filing out of the boardroom, Jennifer made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. She approached Sullivan directly, her expression carrying the seriousness of someone who had recognized the significance of what had just occurred. "Miss Sullivan," she said quietly, "I'd like to continue our conversation privately. There are some things about your background that I think we should discuss." The invitation was extended with the authority of someone whose pilot credentials commanded respect throughout the aviation industry, but also with the discretion of someone who understood that some conversations required privacy and security that conference rooms couldn't provide. Sullivan nodded acceptance, recognizing that her careful efforts to maintain anonymity had been compromised by someone whose expertise made evasion both impossible and potentially unnecessary. The moment marked a turning point where the invisible woman, who had been dismissed as obsolete personnel, would begin the transition back toward her true identity as one of the most accomplished pilots in aviation history. The coffee shop Jennifer chose was deliberately unremarkable. A chain establishment 3 blocks from Meridian's headquarters, where aviation industry conversations would blend seamlessly with the ambient noise of business meetings and casual encounters. She arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a corner table that offered clear sight lines to all entrances while providing acoustic privacy from neighboring conversations. The choice of location and positioning revealed tactical thinking that extended beyond normal commercial pilot training. Margaret Sullivan entered precisely on time, her eyes performing the same systematic assessment of the environment that Jennifer had completed upon her own arrival. The unconscious synchronization of their security protocols suggested shared training that transcended civilian aviation backgrounds, though neither woman acknowledged the similarity explicitly. Margaret ordered black coffee and took the seat that Jennifer had left vacant, the one that provided the best view of potential exit routes. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Jennifer began, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone navigating potentially sensitive territory. "Your technical knowledge in that boardroom was impressive. More than impressive, actually. It was specific in ways that made me think we might have more in common than either of us has been willing to admit." Margaret studied Jennifer's face with the focused attention of someone trained to read micro-expressions and assess trustworthiness under conditions where misjudgment could prove fatal. The evaluation took longer than social convention normally allowed, but Jennifer waited patiently, recognizing the process from her own experience with personnel who had operated in environments where paranoia was a survival skill rather than a personality disorder. "Common background," Margaret repeated carefully, her tone suggesting willingness to explore the topic, while maintaining protective distance from specifics that might prove problematic. "What kind of commonality are you thinking about?" The question was neutral enough to allow retreat if Jennifer's suspicions proved incorrect, but open enough to permit deeper exploration if both women decided that honesty served their mutual interests better than continued evasion. Jennifer recognized the tactical communication style from her own military service, where information sharing required establishing trust through gradual revelation rather than immediate disclosure. "Military aviation," Jennifer said directly, deciding that indirect approaches would waste time neither of them could afford. "Specifically, experimental programs that don't appear in standard service records. Your knowledge of emergency protocols and failure analysis goes beyond what civilian maintenance training provides, way beyond." The admission represented a calculated risk on Jennifer's part. If Margaret's background was genuinely limited to civilian aviation, the statement would seem paranoid and potentially damage any possibility of productive professional relationship. But if Jennifer's instincts were correct, her directness might encourage reciprocal honesty that could prove mutually beneficial. Margaret's reaction confirmed Jennifer's assessment. Instead of confusion or denial, her expression shifted to one of recognition and careful evaluation. She was processing Jennifer's statement not as an accusation to be defended against, but as intelligence to be analyzed for accuracy and implications. "Experimental programs," Margaret said slowly, testing the phrase for hidden meanings while assessing how much information Jennifer might already possess. "That's a broad category. Lots of military aviation work that's classified for reasons that have nothing to do with operational significance." The response was carefully constructed to acknowledge Jennifer's general accuracy while avoiding specific admissions that might compromise security protocols that remained valid despite the passage of years. But Jennifer's military experience had included enough classified aviation programs to recognize the difference between general evasion and security-conscious disclosure limitation. "I flew test missions for the Advanced Tactical Fighter Program in the early 90s, Jennifer said, offering specific information as evidence of her own credentials for handling sensitive aviation topics. "Some of the emergency procedures you described in that boardroom sounded familiar, very familiar." The admission established Jennifer's security clearance history and demonstrated her understanding of the protocols that governed discussion of classified aviation programs. More importantly, it provided Margaret with enough information to assess whether continued conversation served legitimate professional purposes or represented potential security risks. Margaret's evaluation of Jennifer's statement involved more then simple verification of claimed credentials. She was analyzing voice patterns for signs of deception, body language for indicators of hidden agendas, and timing patterns that might suggest coordination with external parties who had reasons for investigating her background. The assessment process reflected training in counterintelligence techniques that extended far beyond normal military aviation security procedures. Advanced tactical fighter, Margaret repeated, her tone suggesting familiarity with the programs, technical requirements, and operational parameters. That was challenging work. Envelope expansion testing with aircraft that pushed performance boundaries in ways that made emergency procedures critically important. The response demonstrated knowledge that couldn't be acquired through casual research or general military aviation experience. Margaret was speaking from direct familiarity with experimental flight testing programs that involved aircraft designs and performance capabilities that remained classified decades after their development. Jennifer felt the same recognition she had experienced in the boardroom, but with greater clarity about its significance. Margaret Sullivan wasn't simply someone with extensive military aviation background. She was someone whose experience included the most advanced and dangerous experimental flight programs that the United States had ever conducted. Envelope expansion, Jennifer said, focusing on the specific terminology Margaret had used. That's test pilot language. Very specific test pilot language. Miss Sullivan, what aircraft did you fly? The question was direct enough to require either honest response or explicit refusal to provide information. Jennifer had reached the point where continued evasion would make productive conversation impossible, but where honest disclosure might reveal information that both women needed to understand their professional relationship and its implications. Margaret made a decision that reflected both calculated risk assessment and intuitive trust in Jennifer's professional integrity. After years of maintaining absolute secrecy about her background, she chose to provide limited but accurate information about her aviation experience. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Stealth prototypes, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of memories that involved aircraft whose existence had never been publicly acknowledged. Pre-production testing of systems that required emergency procedures for scenarios that civilian aviation never encounters. Failure analysis for aircraft whose performance characteristics exceeded everything that had been attempted before. The admission was carefully limited to general categories rather than specific aircraft designations or operational details, but it provided Jennifer with enough information to understand the scope of Margaret's background. Stealth prototype testing represented the absolute pinnacle of experimental aviation, involving aircraft that combined revolutionary technology with performance requirements that pushed both machines and pilots beyond all previous boundaries. Stealth prototypes, Jennifer repeated, her voice reflecting genuine admiration for the courage required to test aircraft, whose basic design principles were largely theoretical. That explains the emergency procedures knowledge, and probably explains why you ended up working maintenance jobs instead of continuing flight operations. The observation was based on Jennifer's understanding of how experimental test programs typically concluded for their participants. Pilots who flew aircraft that officially didn't exist faced career limitations that made transition to civilian aviation complicated by security requirements that never expired. Margaret nodded in confirmation, grateful that Jennifer understood the implications without requiring detailed explanation of the bureaucratic and legal obstacles that prevented experimental test pilots from leveraging their extraordinary experience in conventional aviation careers. Security classifications don't disappear just because programs end, Margaret said, providing the general framework that governed her career choices without discussing specific restrictions that might still be legally enforceable. Some kinds of experience can't be documented on civilian resumes. The statement encapsulated the fundamental challenge faced by personnel who had served in programs whose existence couldn't be acknowledged through normal channels. Their expertise was often superior to anything available in civilian markets. But demonstrating that expertise required discussing activities that remained classified indefinitely. Jennifer understood the contradiction from her own, more limited experience with classified aviation programs. Her test pilot work with the Advanced Tactical Fighter had been declassified eventually, allowing her to leverage that experience in commercial aviation careers. But she recognized that Margaret's background probably involved programs whose classification levels precluded any public acknowledgement. That must have been incredibly frustrating, Jennifer said, her tone reflecting genuine empathy for the professional limitations that extraordinary service had created rather than solved. Having capabilities that you can't demonstrate because the evidence is classified. Frustration is part of the job, Margaret replied, her voice carrying the acceptance of someone who had made peace with choices that prioritized national security over personal career advancement. The work mattered more than the recognition. But Jennifer sensed that Margaret's story involved more than simple classification restrictions. The emotional weight in her voice suggested personal losses that extended beyond career limitations, experiences that had cost her more than just professional recognition. "Miss Sullivan," Jennifer said carefully, "I get the impression that your background includes more than just test flying. The way you analyzed those emergency scenarios in the boardroom suggested operational experience, not just experimental flight testing." The observation was based on subtle differences Jennifer had noticed between Margaret's knowledge base and her own. Test pilots understood aircraft performance and emergency procedures, but Margaret's analysis had included tactical considerations that suggested experience with aviation operations in hostile environments. Margaret's expression shifted as she considered how much additional information she could safely share with someone whose security clearance history might not extend to the programs that had defined the most significant years of her aviation career. "Some test programs involved operational scenarios," she said eventually, choosing words that acknowledged Jennifer's perception without providing specific details about missions that remained sensitive for reasons extending beyond simple technological classification. The admission suggested that Margaret's experience included not just experimental aircraft testing but actual operational deployment of those aircraft in environments where their advanced capabilities were required for missions that conventional aircraft couldn't accomplish. Jennifer felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to align in ways that suggested Margaret's background was even more extraordinary than she had initially suspected. Operational deployment of experimental stealth aircraft implied involvement with intelligence programs or special operations missions that represented the most classified and dangerous work that military aviation had ever conducted. "Operational scenarios," Jennifer repeated, her tone reflecting a growing understanding of why Margaret had ended up working maintenance jobs, despite capabilities that should have made her one of the most sought-after aviation professionals in the world. "Miss Sullivan, you weren't just a test pilot. You were operational." The statement was more observation than question, based on Jennifer's analysis of the evidence Margaret had provided combined with her own understanding of how experimental aircraft programs intersected with intelligence and special operations requirements. Margaret's silence confirmed Jennifer's assessment while avoiding explicit admission of activities that might still be subject to security restrictions that could be legally enforced against unauthorized disclosure. "I think," Jennifer said slowly, "that I'm beginning to understand why you reacted so strongly to Blackwood's presentation, and why you ended up working maintenance instead of flying, and probably why you seem to know more about aviation safety than people who've spent their entire careers in commercial flight operations." The observation represented Jennifer's synthesis of the information Margaret had provided, combined with her own experience with the intersection between military and civilian aviation careers. She was beginning to understand that Margaret's story involved sacrifice and service at levels that extended far beyond normal military aviation experience. Margaret studied Jennifer's face with the same careful attention she had applied throughout their conversation, but her expression had shifted from defensive evaluation to something approaching trust. Jennifer's understanding of the implications and restrictions that governed classified aviation careers had demonstrated both competence and discretion that made continued conversation feel safe rather than risky. "Captain Torres," Margaret said, using Jennifer's formal title for the first time, "I think we understand each other better than either of us expected when this conversation began." The statement represented acknowledgement that both women had backgrounds that extended beyond conventional civilian aviation experience, and that their shared understanding of classified program restrictions created a foundation for professional relationship based on mutual respect rather than suspicion. "I think we do," Jennifer agreed. "And I think that understanding might be important for reasons beyond simple professional courtesy." The observation was based on Jennifer's growing conviction that Margaret's presence at Meridian represented more than coincidental employment. Someone with her background didn't end up working aircraft maintenance by accident, and her technical critique of Blackwood's presentation suggested purposes that extended beyond routine job responsibilities. "Important how?" Margaret asked, her tone indicating genuine curiosity about Jennifer's assessment of their situation's broader implications. "Because," Jennifer said, "I think Richard Blackwood just made the mistake of publicly humiliating someone whose aviation experience makes his technological solutions look like amateur hour. And I think that mistake is going to have consequences that none of us can predict yet." The prediction was based on Jennifer's understanding of how extraordinary expertise intersected with corporate politics in ways that often produced unexpected outcomes. Margaret's background suggested capabilities for addressing aviation safety challenges that extended far beyond anything Blackwood's automated systems could provide. But more importantly, Jennifer was beginning to suspect that Margaret's presence at Meridian and her willingness to challenge Blackwood's presentation publicly might be related to larger issues involving aviation safety that neither the board nor Blackwood fully understood. Margaret's expression suggested that Jennifer's assessment was accurate, and that the conversation had reached the point where deeper cooperation might serve mutual interests that extended beyond individual career considerations. "Captain Torres," Margaret said quietly, "I think you're right about the consequences. And I think you and I might need to work together to make sure those consequences serve aviation safety rather than corporate politics." The statement represented a shift from defensive evasion to active collaboration, based on Margaret's assessment that Jennifer's expertise and position at Meridian could prove crucial for addressing challenges that required both operational aviation experience and access to commercial airline decision-making processes. Jennifer nodded agreement, recognizing that their conversation had evolved into something that might prove pivotal for issues extending far beyond their individual professional circumstances. The investigation Jennifer launched that evening began with simple curiosity, but evolved into something that would fundamentally alter her understanding of aviation history and her own place within it. Her home office overlooked the San Francisco Bay, its walls lined with certificates and photographs that documented 23 years of commercial aviation achievement. But tonight those accomplishments seemed insignificant compared to the mystery she was attempting to unravel. Her security clearance from military service remained active through consulting work with aerospace contractors, providing access to databases that most civilian pilots could never reach. The search parameters she entered were carefully constructed to avoid triggering security alerts, while exploring historical records of experimental aviation programs that might contain references to Margaret Sullivan or her operational designations. The initial results were frustratingly sparse. Margaret Sullivan appeared in standard personnel databases as a civilian maintenance worker, with unremarkable employment history dating back 15 years. Her Social Security records showed steady work at various aerospace companies, always in technical positions that utilized her mechanical skills, but never in roles that would require security clearances or background investigations that might reveal inconsistencies in her documented history. But Jennifer's experience with classified programs had taught her that absence of evidence often constituted evidence itself. People who disappeared from official records usually did so for reasons that involved national security rather than personal choice. The question was whether Margaret's invisibility reflected witness protection, intelligence operations, or something even more sensitive. That the breakthrough came through cross-referencing accident reports with experimental aircraft testing incidents that had occurred during the time frame when Margaret claimed to have been flying stealth prototypes. Jennifer found references to crashes involving unspecified military aircraft during periods when multiple stealth programs were conducting operational testing, but the reports contained no pilot names or specific aircraft designations. One report particularly caught her attention: a classified summary of an incident involving an experimental reconnaissance aircraft that had suffered catastrophic system failure during a mission over hostile territory in 1997. The pilot had successfully completed the mission despite multiple equipment failures and had managed to return the aircraft to friendly airspace before ejecting. The summary noted that the pilot's exceptional skill and determination under extreme conditions had prevented the loss of critical intelligence assets and preserved operational security. The incident matched the time frame and circumstances that would align with Margaret's claimed background, but the report provided no identifying information about the pilot involved. However, Jennifer noticed something significant in the language used to describe the pilot's actions. The phrasing was identical to commendation texts she had seen in her own military service, suggesting that whoever wrote the report was following standard templates used for exceptional performance under combat conditions. Her search expanded to include Medal of Honor and Distinguished Flying Cross recipients from classified programs, thinking that someone with Margaret's described background would almost certainly have received recognition for extraordinary service. The results were more promising but equally frustrating. Several awards had been presented for classified aerospace operations during the relevant time period, but recipient names had been redacted from all available databases. The pattern was consistent with security protocols used for personnel whose identities needed permanent protection due to ongoing operational security requirements. But it also suggested that Margaret's service had been significant, enough to warrant the highest levels of military recognition, which made her current employment as an aircraft maintenance worker seem even more inexplicable. Jennifer's investigation took a different direction when she decided to examine corporate records related to aerospace companies that had employed Margaret over the past 15 years. The pattern of her employment revealed interesting anomalies that suggested purposes beyond simple maintenance work. Every company where Margaret had worked had experienced significant improvements in safety records during her tenure. Accident rates decreased, maintenance efficiency increased, and pilot satisfaction with aircraft performance showed measurable improvement. The improvements were substantial enough to attract attention from industry analysts, but they were always attributed to general operational enhancements rather than individual contributions. More intriguingly, several of the companies had been involved in aerospace contracts that included classified government work. Margaret's employment at these companies had coincided with periods when they were developing or testing aircraft systems that required security clearances and background investigations for personnel with access to sensitive technologies. The correlation suggested that Margaret's presence at these companies might have been coordinated through government channels rather than normal civilian employment processes. Someone with her background wouldn't randomly drift from one aerospace contractor to another unless there were specific reasons for her to be in those particular positions at those particular times. Jennifer's analysis of the employment pattern revealed something even more significant. Margaret's job changes had occurred immediately before or after major aircraft accidents or safety incidents that involved the companies where she had been working. The timing suggested that her presence might have been related to accident prevention or post-incident analysis in ways that weren't reflected in public reports. The most disturbing pattern emerged when Jennifer cross-referenced Margaret's employment history with aviation accidents that had been officially attributed to pilot error or mechanical failure. In several cases, companies where Margaret had worked had experienced near-miss incidents or minor accidents that could have been catastrophic under slightly different circumstances. The incidents shared common characteristics: complex system failures that occurred under conditions where automated safety systems proved inadequate, requiring pilot intervention based on experience and judgment that exceeded standard training protocols. In each case, disaster had been averted through actions that demonstrated exactly the kind of advanced emergency response capabilities that Margaret had described in the boardroom. Jennifer began to suspect that Margaret's civilian employment might be part of an ongoing mission to prevent aviation accidents through direct involvement in commercial airline operations. Someone with her background would be uniquely qualified to identify potential safety problems that escape detection through normal regulatory oversight and industry safety protocols. The theory gained support when Jennifer discovered that several aviation safety improvements implemented throughout the industry over the past 15 years had originated from recommendations submitted by companies where Margaret had been employed. The improvements were always attributed to internal safety audits or regulatory compliance initiatives, but the technical sophistication of the recommendations suggested expertise that exceeded normal commercial aviation experience. Her investigation reached a turning point when she accessed classified databases that required her highest security clearance levels. The search parameters she used were specifically designed to identify female pilots who had received the highest levels of military recognition for classified operations during the 1990s time period. The results were limited to 5 individuals, each identified only by operational code names and service record summaries that had been heavily redacted. But one entry contained details that aligned perfectly with Margaret's described background: project, Ghostwing pilot with extensive stealth aircraft operational experience, multiple combat missions in denied territory, recipient of classified commendations for extraordinary performance under extreme conditions. The entry included a reference to post-service civilian oversight responsibilities that suggested ongoing duties rather than simple retirement from military service. The language implied that the individual's transition to civilian employment was part of an official assignment rather than personal career choice. Jennifer found herself staring at evidence that Margaret Sullivan might not simply be a former military pilot working maintenance jobs to pay bills. She might be an active agent whose mission involved protecting commercial aviation through direct involvement in airline operations, using her extraordinary expertise to prevent accidents that conventional safety systems couldn't address. Implications were staggering. If Margaret was operating under official cover, her presence at Meridian might be related to specific threats or vulnerabilities that required intervention by someone with capabilities that exceeded normal commercial aviation resources. Her confrontation with Blackwood in the boardroom might have been motivated by professional concerns that extended far beyond simple disagreement with technological solutions. But Jennifer's investigation also revealed why Margaret's continued cover was essential. The aviation industry's commercial and regulatory structures weren't designed to accommodate personnel whose expertise derived from classified programs that officially didn't exist. Someone with Margaret's background could only operate effectively by maintaining the fiction that her knowledge came from conventional sources. The revelation forced Jennifer to reconsider everything she thought she understood about aviation safety. and the measures taken to protect commercial airline operations. Margaret's presence suggested that threats existed which required response capabilities that extended beyond what regulatory agencies and airline corporations could provide through normal channels. Her research into Blackwood's background provided additional context that made Margaret's intervention seem even more significant. Richard Blackwood's career had been built on acquiring innovative technologies developed by others and marketing them as his own innovations. His reputation for aggressive cost-cutting masked a pattern of eliminating personnel who might challenge his claims of authorship for work they had actually performed. But more troubling was Jennifer's discovery that several of Blackwood's previous technology implementations had been associated with safety incidents that were officially attributed to pilot error or maintenance failures. The incidents shared characteristics that suggested problems with automated systems that exceeded their designed parameters, exactly the kind of failures that Margaret had warned about in the boardroom. The pattern suggested that Blackwood's technology solutions might represent genuine threats to aviation safety, and that Margaret's presence at Meridian might be specifically related to preventing implementation of systems that could cause catastrophic accidents under conditions that weren't adequately addressed in testing protocols. Jennifer realized that her conversation with Margaret had been more significant than either of them had initially understood. They weren't simply two aviation professionals sharing technical concerns about automated flight systems. They were potentially collaborating on issues that involved national security and public safety at levels that required extraordinary expertise and absolute discretion. The investigation had transformed her understanding of Margaret from curiosity about an unusually knowledgeable maintenance worker to recognition that she might be working with one of the most accomplished and important aviation professionals in American history. Someone whose service continued through channels that remained classified, but whose impact on commercial aviation safety was probably immeasurable. But the investigation also revealed the enormous personal cost that Margaret's service had required. She had sacrificed recognition, career advancement, and normal professional relationships to serve in ways that could never be publicly acknowledged. Her expertise was legendary within circles that officially didn't exist, but she remained invisible to the industry that benefited from her protection. Jennifer understood that her next conversation with Margaret would need to address not just technical concerns about Blackwood's presentation, but the broader implications of what they were facing together. The stakes involved more than corporate politics or individual career interests. They were dealing with aviation safety issues that could affect thousands of lives, requiring cooperation between professionals whose backgrounds equipped them to address challenges that others couldn't even recognize. The emergency began at 3:47 a.m. Pacific Time when Southwest Flight 2847, en route from Phoenix to San Francisco, encountered icing conditions that exceeded all weather forecast predictions. Captain David Chen was conducting what should have been a routine red-eye flight with 147 passengers and 6 crew members, but the ice accumulation on the aircraft's wings and control surfaces was building at a rate that threatened to overwhelm the de-icing systems within minutes. The aircraft's automated weather radar had detected the storm system, but had classified it as moderate precipitation rather than the severe icing conditions that were actually developing. The integrated flight management system that Blackwood had been promoting was installed on this particular Boeing 737 as part of Meridian's evaluation program, and it was providing recommendations that contradicted both the crew's visual observations and their experience-based instincts about the severity of their situation. Margaret's phone rang in her apartment overlooking the bay, pulling her from the light sleep that had replaced normal rest patterns years ago when hypervigilance became a permanent condition rather than a temporary response to danger. The caller identification showed Meridian Airlines Operations Center, which meant either a routine maintenance question or an emergency that required expertise beyond what standard protocols could provide. Margaret, this is Jennifer Torres. We have a situation that requires your immediate assistance. The urgency in Jennifer's voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakable to someone trained to recognize crisis communication patterns. Southwest 2847 is experiencing severe icing conditions, and the automated systems are providing conflicting guidance. The crew is requesting emergency consultation with our most experienced personnel. The request was unprecedented in Margaret's 15 years of civilian aviation work. Commercial airline operation centers didn't typically contact maintenance personnel for in-flight emergency consultation unless the situation involved technical knowledge that exceeded what flight operations specialists could provide. But Jennifer's call suggested that someone had recognized the connection between Margaret's background and the kind of expertise that might be needed for crisis resolution. Margaret's response was immediate and professional, reflecting training that had prepared her for emergency deployment under conditions where minutes could determine whether hundreds of people lived or died. What's the aircraft's current position, and what specific guidance are the automated systems providing? They're approximately 200 miles southeast of San Francisco, maintaining flight level 350 but requesting descent due to icing. The IFMS is recommending continued cruise altitude with increased airspeed, but the crew is reporting that ice accumulation is affecting control response and engine performance. The description immediately triggered Margaret's recognition of a scenario she had encountered multiple times during her operational career, when experimental aircraft had faced weather conditions that exceeded the parameters of their automated systems. The fundamental problem wasn't technical malfunction, but rather the limitations of automated decision-making when confronting situations that fell outside the algorithm's training data. Tell them to disregard the automated altitude recommendation immediately, Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced similar situations when the consequences of wrong decisions were measured and classified. Mission failures rather than commercial aviation statistics. Ice accumulation at that altitude and temperature combination will continue regardless of airspeed changes. They need descent to warmer air as quickly as possible. Jennifer relayed Margaret's recommendation to the operations center while simultaneously patching Margaret into the direct communication channel with Flight 2847, the unprecedented step of allowing civilian maintenance personnel to provide real-time guidance to commercial airline crews violated multiple regulatory protocols, but the severity of the situation justified extraordinary measures. Southwest 2847. This is Margaret Sullivan with Meridian Technical Support. I understand you're experiencing severe icing conditions that are exceeding your automated system recommendations. Can you provide me with current ice accumulation observations and control surface response characteristics? Captain Chun's voice carried the controlled stress of a professional pilot dealing with an emergency that was escalating beyond what his training had prepared him to handle. We're seeing approximately 2 inches of ice buildup on the leading edges, and the control surfaces are becoming increasingly sluggish. The IFMS keeps recommending airspeed increases, but that's making the ice accumulation worse. Margaret recognized the classic symptoms of ice-induced aerodynamic degradation, a condition she had encountered during high-altitude reconnaissance missions when weather avoidance wasn't possible due to operational requirements. The solution required prioritizing fundamental aerodynamics over automated system recommendations, but implementing it required pilot techniques that weren't taught in standard commercial training programs. Captain Chun, you need to initiate immediate descent to flight level 250, while simultaneously reducing airspeed to minimum controllable velocity. I know the automated systems are recommending the opposite, but those algorithms weren't designed for the icing conditions you're currently experiencing. The recommendation contradicted both automated guidance and standard operating procedures. that emphasized maintaining altitude and airspeed during emergencies. But Margaret's suggestion was based on principles of ice formation and aerodynamic performance that had been learned through experimental flight testing under conditions that commercial aviation regulations were designed to avoid. Margaret. Jennifer's voice cut into the communication channel. The operations center is questioning whether we have authority to override automated system recommendations for commercial flights. The regulatory concern was legitimate, but irrelevant given the immediate threat to aircraft and passengers. Margaret had faced similar bureaucratic obstacles during military operations when chain of command protocols conflicted with operational necessities that required immediate action. Tell them that Southwest 2847 is facing conditions where regulatory compliance is less important than keeping the aircraft controllable. Margaret replied, her tone carrying the matter-of-fact authority of someone who had made life or death decisions when conventional procedures proved inadequate. Captain Chun's training had emphasized following automated system guidance and regulatory procedures. But his 20 years of flying experience told him that the ice accumulation was approaching critical levels that could make the aircraft uncontrollable regardless of what the computers recommended. Margaret's suggestions aligned with his instinctive assessment of the situation, even though they contradicted everything he had been taught about emergency response protocols. Beginning descent to flight level 250 and reducing airspeed per your recommendation, Chun reported, his voice reflecting the controlled anxiety of a pilot choosing between conflicting authorities when passengers' lives depended on making the correct decision. Margaret monitored the aircraft's progress through real-time data feeds that Jennifer had arranged through Meridian's operations center, watching altitude, airspeed, and weather radar returns that showed the severity of the icing conditions that Flight 2847 was encountering. The storm system was more intense than forecast models had predicted, creating exactly the kind of scenario where automated systems proved inadequate for ensuring aircraft safety. Southwest 2847, as you descend through flight level 300, you should begin experiencing temperature increases that will start reducing ice accumulation. But you'll need to maintain reduced airspeed until you're completely clear of icing conditions, regardless of what the automated systems recommend. For fuel efficiency, the guidance was based on Margaret's experience with aircraft performance under extreme conditions, knowledge that had been earned through missions where fuel efficiency was secondary to mission completion and crew survival. Commercial aviation training emphasized fuel management and schedule adherence, but emergency situations required prioritizing aircraft controllability over economic considerations. Ice buildup is definitely decreasing, Captain Chun reported as the aircraft descended through the warmer air layers. Control response is improving and engine performance is stabilizing. Your recommendations appear to have prevented what could have been a catastrophic situation. The successful resolution of the emergency was noted by Federal Aviation Administration controllers who had been monitoring the situation. But the official incident report would attribute the positive outcome to exceptional crew performance under challenging conditions, rather than acknowledging the role of unofficial technical consultation that had violated standard operating procedures. Margaret's intervention had prevented a potential disaster, but it had also exposed her expertise in ways that could compromise the careful anonymity she had maintained throughout her civilian aviation career. The recorded communications between her and Flight 2847 would be reviewed by regulatory investigators who might ask questions about how a maintenance worker had acquired knowledge that exceeded what most commercial pilots possessed. Jennifer understood the implications immediately. Margaret, we need to discuss how this incident gets documented. Your technical knowledge just saved 153 lives. But explaining how you knew what to do might create problems for both of us. The dilemma was characteristic of Margaret's entire civilian career. Her expertise was invaluable for preventing aviation accidents, but demonstrating that expertise required revealing background information that could compromise ongoing operational security requirements. Every successful intervention created evidence of capabilities that shouldn't exist in her official employment record. "The important thing is that everyone got home safely," Margaret replied, falling back on the same deflection techniques she had used throughout her civilian employment. Emergency situations require improvisation based on whatever knowledge is available. But the Flight 2847 incident had attracted attention from parties whose interest extended beyond routine safety investigations. The successful resolution of an emergency that had exceeded automated system capabilities would be analyzed by aerospace engineers who wanted to understand why their sophisticated algorithms had proven inadequate when human judgment had succeeded. Richard Blackwood learned about the incident through corporate networks that tracked aviation safety events relevant to his technology implementations. The failure of his integrated flight management system to provide appropriate guidance during critical emergency conditions represented a potential liability that could undermine his entire business model if the details became public knowledge. More troubling was the information he received about Margaret Sullivan's role in resolving the crisis. His investigation into her background had revealed inconsistencies that suggested expertise far beyond what maintenance personnel typically possessed. But the Flight 2847 incident provided concrete evidence that she represented a threat to his technology's market credibility. The incident also attracted attention from government agencies whose responsibility included monitoring civilian aviation for threats that might require specialized response capabilities. Margaret's successful intervention using knowledge that exceeded standard commercial aviation training would trigger reviews by intelligence personnel who tracked individuals with backgrounds that might indicate ongoing operational responsibilities. Margaret realized that her decision to assist Flight 2847 had accelerated the timeline for decisions she had been postponing throughout her civilian career. Her cover identity was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as evidence accumulated that her expertise derived from sources that couldn't be explained through conventional channels. But the alternative to exposure was allowing preventable aviation accidents to occur when her knowledge could make the difference between disaster and successful emergency resolution. The choice between personal security and public safety had been the defining dilemma of her military career, and it remained equally challenging in civilian contexts where the stakes were measured in passenger lives rather than classified mission objectives. The successful resolution of the Southwest 2847 emergency had demonstrated that Margaret's expertise remained as valuable in civilian aviation as it had been during her military service. But it had also proven that her continued effectiveness might require abandoning the anonymity that had protected her for 15 years of civilian employment. Jennifer understood that the incident had changed everything for both of them. Margaret's intervention had saved lives, but it had also revealed capabilities that would inevitably attract scrutiny from parties whose interest might extend far beyond aviation safety considerations. The aftermath of Southwest Flight 2847 created ripples that spread through the aviation industry with the persistence of shock waves from a controlled explosion. Within 48 hours, Margaret Sullivan's name appeared in preliminary incident reports that would eventually reach Federal Aviation Administration headquarters, National Transportation Safety Board investigators, and aerospace industry analysts whose job was to identify trends that might affect commercial aviation safety protocols. Patricia Hayes convened an emergency board meeting at Meridian Airlines to address the implications of having a maintenance worker provide real-time emergency consultation that had potentially saved 153 lives, while simultaneously exposing the company to regulatory questions about unauthorized technical guidance during in-flight emergencies. The legal department was particularly concerned about liability issues related to Margaret's recommendations. which had contradicted automated system guidance and standard operating procedures. But the technical staff who reviewed the incident recordings reached different conclusions. Chief Engineer Thomas Rodriguez had listened to Margaret's guidance multiple times, analyzing her recommendations against established aerodynamic principles and emergency response protocols. Her suggestions had been technically sound and operationally appropriate for the specific conditions Flight 2847 had encountered, demonstrating expertise that exceeded what most commercial aviation professionals possessed. Her knowledge of icing conditions and aircraft performance under extreme weather was extraordinary, Rodriguez reported to the board. She provided guidance that probably prevented a catastrophic accident, but the level of technical sophistication in her recommendation suggests background that goes far beyond routine maintenance experience. The observation created a dilemma that Patricia Hayes had been avoiding since Margaret's confrontation with Blackwood in the boardroom. Meridian Airlines employed someone whose expertise was clearly valuable for aviation safety, but whose background couldn't be verified through normal channels and whose continued employment might create regulatory complications that could affect the company's operating certificates. Richard Blackwood's response to the incident was more aggressive and personal. His investigation into Margaret's background had revealed enough inconsistencies to convince him that she represented a deliberate threat to his business interests. Rather than simply an aging maintenance worker with opinions about aviation technology, the failure of his integrated flight management system during the Southwest emergency provided her with concrete evidence that his automated solutions had limitations that could prove dangerous under conditions that weren't adequately addressed in testing protocols. His corporate security team had been tasked with developing a comprehensive profile of Margaret Sullivan that would either discredit her technical credibility or provide grounds for legal action that would eliminate her ability to interfere with his technology implementations. The investigation had uncovered employment patterns and technical knowledge that suggested government connections, but proving those connections required access to classified databases that exceeded his corporate resources. Blackwood's solution was characteristically direct and ruthless. If he couldn't destroy Margaret's credibility through exposure of her background, he would eliminate her effectiveness by ensuring that her continued employment at Meridian became impossible through regulatory pressure and legal intimidation. That would force her back into the anonymity she had maintained for 15 years. The pressure campaign began with anonymous complaints to the Federal Aviation Administration about unauthorized technical consultation during commercial airline emergencies. The complaints suggested that Meridian Airlines was circumventing established safety protocols by allowing unqualified personnel to provide guidance that could affect passenger safety and regulatory compliance. Simultaneously, Blackwood arranged for aerospace industry publications to receive information about the Southwest 2847 incident that emphasized the dangers of allowing maintenance personnel to override sophisticated automated systems based on intuition rather than data-driven analysis. The article suggested that the incident represented a dangerous precedent that could undermine confidence in advanced aviation technologies, but Blackwood's campaign encountered unexpected resistance from sources he hadn't anticipated. The crew of Southwest 2847 provided detailed statements to investigators that praised Margaret's guidance and credited her recommendations with preventing what could have been a catastrophic accident. Captain Chun was particularly emphatic about the value of her technical expertise, noting that her suggestions had proven more accurate than the automated system guidance he had initially been following. More significantly, Jennifer Torres had been conducting her own investigation into the patterns of aviation incidents that had occurred at companies where Margaret had been employed. Her analysis revealed a correlation between Margaret's presence and improved safety records that was too consistent to be coincidental, suggesting that her contributions to aviation safety extended far beyond the Southwest 2847 incident. Jennifer's research had also uncovered evidence that several major aviation safety improvements implemented throughout the industry over the past decade had originated from recommendations submitted by companies where Margaret had worked. The improvements were always attributed to internal safety audits or regulatory compliance initiatives, but the technical sophistication of the recommendations suggested expertise that exceeded normal commercial aviation experience. The documentation Jennifer compiled painted a picture of someone who had been quietly preventing aviation accidents for years through direct involvement in commercial airline operations, using extraordinary expertise to identify and address safety problems that escape detection through normal regulatory oversight and industry safety protocols. Margaret's response to the mounting pressure was characteristically methodical and strategic. She had faced similar investigations during her military career when operational security requirements conflicted with administrative transparency demands, and she understood that survival required careful management of information flow rather than complete concealment or total disclosure. Her first step was to contact Jennifer with a proposal for complete cooperation in documenting her contributions to aviation safety, but only under conditions that would protect information that remained classified for national security reasons. The arrangement would allow Jennifer to advocate for her professionally while maintaining the operational security requirements that governed her civilian employment. "I need you to understand that my background includes information that can't be shared through normal channels," Margaret explained during a secure meeting at Jennifer's apartment. "But I can provide enough documentation to demonstrate that my expertise serves legitimate aviation safety purposes without compromising sensitive material." The proposal represented a calculated risk that balanced Margaret's need for professional protection against the security requirements that had governed her entire civilian career. By providing Jennifer with limited but verifiable information about her contributions, she could establish credibility that might withstand regulatory scrutiny while avoiding complete exposure of her classified background. Jennifer accepted the responsibility with full understanding of its implications. Her own military background provided her with security clearances and professional credibility that could legitimize Margaret's expertise without requiring detailed explanation of its origins. More importantly, her position at Meridian Airlines gave her access to corporate and regulatory channels that could influence how the incident was officially documented. The collaboration between Jennifer and Margaret produced a comprehensive safety analysis that demonstrated the value of human expertise in aviation emergency situations where automated systems proved inadequate. The analysis used the Southwest 2847 incident as a case study while documenting broader patterns that showed the continued importance of experienced personnel in maintaining commercial aviation safety. Their joint report was submitted to the Federal Aviation Administration, the National Transportation Safety Board, and aerospace industry safety organizations as evidence that technological advancement needed to complement, rather than replace, human expertise in aviation operations. The report's recommendations included provisions for incorporating experienced personnel into emergency response protocols and ensuring that automated systems included override capabilities for situations that exceeded their program parameters. The industry response to their analysis was overwhelmingly positive from operational personnel who understood the realities of aviation safety, but met resistance from corporate interests that preferred technological solutions to personnel-based approaches due to cost considerations and liability concerns. Margaret's expertise had finally been documented in ways that could be publicly acknowledged, but the process had also attracted attention that made her continued anonymity impossible. Government agencies whose responsibility included monitoring civilian aviation for national security implications had begun reviewing her background through channels that could eventually compromise the operational security that had protected her for 15 years. The situation reached a critical point when Patricia Hayes received a confidential communication from government representatives whose identity and agency affiliation weren't disclosed, but whose authority to ask questions about Margaret's employment was clearly established through proper channels. The communication suggested that Margaret's background included information relevant to national security, but that her continued civilian employment served legitimate purposes that shouldn't be disrupted through unnecessary investigation. Implicit message was that Margaret Sullivan was under official protection, and that attempts to investigate her background or interfere with her employment might encounter resistance from government agencies whose authority exceeded what commercial aviation companies could challenge through normal legal channels. Richard Blackwood's pressure campaign suddenly encountered obstacles that he couldn't overcome through corporate resources or legal intimidation. His complaints to regulatory agencies were met with responses that suggested his concerns had been noted, but wouldn't be pursued through normal investigative channels. His attempts to generate negative publicity about the Southwest incident were countered by positive coverage that emphasized the value of experienced personnel in maintaining aviation safety. Most importantly, aerospace companies that had been considering Blackwood's technology solutions began requesting additional testing that would address the limitations revealed during the Southwest 2847 emergency. The incident had created market demand for automated systems that included better provisions for human oversight and intervention, requirements that Blackwood's current technology couldn't satisfy without extensive and expensive modifications. Margaret Sullivan had achieved something unprecedented in her civilian career: official recognition of her expertise, without complete exposure of her classified background. Her contributions to aviation safety were now documented in government and industry reports that established her credibility while maintaining the operational security that allowed her to continue serving in ways that others couldn't. But the victory came with costs that would reshape her life in fundamental ways. The anonymity that had protected her for 15 years was permanently compromised, replaced by official acknowledgement that brought both opportunities and responsibilities that would define the next phase of her service to aviation safety. Jennifer Torres had become more than a professional ally. She had become a partner in ensuring that Margaret's extraordinary expertise continued to serve commercial aviation safety while navigating the complex intersection between classified backgrounds and civilian employment that would always create challenges requiring careful management and mutual trust. The legacy of Southwest Flight 2847 would extend far beyond a single successful emergency resolution. It had demonstrated that some forms of expertise couldn't be replaced by technology, and that protecting aviation safety sometimes required accepting personnel whose backgrounds couldn't be completely explained through conventional channels, but whose contributions were too valuable to sacrifice for administrative convenience. Margaret Sullivan remained officially a maintenance worker at Meridian Airlines, but her role had evolved to include responsibilities that reflected her true capabilities, while maintaining the cover identity that allowed her to continue operating in commercial aviation environments. The ghost had finally been recognized, but she remained invisible enough to continue the mission that had defined her entire adult life. 6 months later, Margaret Sullivan stood in Hangar 12 at San Francisco International Airport, not as a maintenance worker, but as the newly appointed Director of Emergency Response Training for the Federal Aviation Administration. Her official title barely hinted at the revolutionary changes she was implementing throughout commercial aviation. The young pilots she now trained came from airlines across the country, learning techniques that couldn't be found in any manual. "Feel the aircraft," she told them, just as she had taught mechanics years before. "The computers tell you what should happen. Your experience tells you what will happen." Richard Blackwood's technology company had quietly declared bankruptcy. After multiple airlines canceled contracts, following additional incidents where his automated systems failed during emergencies. He had disappeared from the industry, his reputation destroyed by the very expertise he had tried to dismiss. Jennifer Torres, now Meridian's chief safety officer, worked closely with Margaret to develop new protocols that balanced technological advancement with human judgment. Their partnership had become a model for the industry, proving that innovation required both cutting-edge systems and experienced professionals who understood their limitations. The transformation hadn't been easy. Margaret's cover story remained partially intact. Her classified background stayed hidden, but her expertise was finally being used to its full potential. She was no longer invisible, no longer underestimated, no longer dismissed as too old to adapt. Every evening, Margaret returned to her apartment overlooking the bay, knowing that somewhere in the sky, pilots were flying safer because of training she had provided, using protocols she had developed, equipped with knowledge that could save lives when technology alone wasn't enough. The ghost of the hangar had become aviation's guardian angel, proving that true expertise never ages. It only deepens with experience. What did you think of Margaret's incredible journey? Her story proves that experience and wisdom can never be replaced by technology alone. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes. Drop a comment below telling us about a time when someone underestimated you. We love hearing your stories. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments, and remember, every person has a story worth telling. See you in the next one.